Morning class, this is ECON 512, Introduction to International Trade class. Today is March 3rd, Thursday. The class will move on to Chapter 7 of your textbook, External Economies of Scale and the International Location of Production. In Chapter 3, we pointed out that there are two reasons why countries specialize in trade. First, countries differ either in their resources or in their technology and specialize in things they do relatively well. Second, economies of scale make it advantageous for each country to specialize in the production of only a limited range of goods and services. Chapter 3 through 6 considered models in which all trade is based on comparative advantage. That is, differences between countries are the only reason for trade. This chapter introduces the role of economies of scale. Here is the order of video clips. 1. Economies of offshoring. 2. Gains from multinationals. 3. International trade disciplines and monopolies. 4. Intra-industry trade. 5. Intra-Firm trade. 6. Trade and external economies of scale. Here is the first video clip.
We're back on location talking some more about international trade. That's why I'm wearing my special shirt. In the last lecture, we showed how you could use the supply and demand diagram to represent an equilibrium when the world price is given. Remember, we were talking about France and this product, the pomelo. Let's look back at that diagram that we drew before. The red curve represents domestic demand, and the blue curve represents domestic supply. The world price is given, and the difference between domestic demand and domestic supply at that price is the volume of imports. Now notice something. If France were a closed economy and had to make its own pomelos, the price would be up here at P star, where the curves intersect. Because the world price is below this price, the price that would occur in a closed economy, we say that France does not have a comparative advantage in the production of pomelos. That's why France imports them. Because if French farmers had to make pomelos themselves, their costs would very quickly rise above the world price. That is, the blue curve rises very quickly above PW. It's cheaper for France to import its pomelos rather than to make them at home. Now we're going to talk about another case. In the second case, we'll look at another product where France does have a comparative advantage. That is, a situation where the world price is greater than the domestic equilibrium price. The product that we'll choose to examine is wine. Let's imagine now that France is, for the sake of our story, a small country when it comes to the production of wine. That means that France can buy all of the wine that it wants and make all of the wine that it wants without influencing the world price for wine. We have to make this assumption of a small country, even though it's unrealistic. We have to make it in order to be able to use the model that we've been using. So let's look at the picture. In this case, the red demand curve represents the domestic demand for wine. It tells us how much wine people in France would like to consume at different prices, given their income, price of substitutes, complements, and all of those other things that influence demand. The blue curve represents the domestic supply of wine. As the price rises, producers in France will make and offer for sale more and more wine as they are able to cover the increasing opportunity cost of making more and more wine. If France were a closed economy, the price of wine would be determined where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect. This would be the equilibrium price, and here you'd have the equilibrium quantity. Now, let's suppose, for the sake of our story, that the world price for wine is greater than this equilibrium for a closed economy. Let's put the world price for wine way up here, maybe $8 a bottle. At this world price for wine, we can draw in a dashed line that touches the demand curve and the supply curve, and we'll see how the French economy would respond to this opportunity to trade at this world price. Well, notice first, at this high price for wine, French consumers want to purchase this quantity determined by the intersection of PW with the demand curve. The quantity of wine demanded domestically, we can write down here on the axis as QDD. The quantity of wine supplied domestically can be found by going over to the domestic supply curve. At the price of $8 per bottle, the domestic producers of wine want to produce this larger quantity, and we can mark it down here on the axis as QSD, the domestic quantity supplied. Now notice, the quantity supplied domestically is greater than the quantity demanded domestically at this higher price. If we were in a closed economy, of course, this could not be an equilibrium. The bidding mechanism would push the price of wine downwards until we reach the intersection of the two curves. But because we have an opportunity to trade internationally, this higher price for wine does not give us an excess supply, but rather gives us a lot of extra wine that can be exported. The difference between domestic consumption of wine and domestic production at this high price becomes France's export volume. That is, the difference between the two is the quantity of wine exported. The equilibrium in this case is not a price level. The price level is given to us from outside the model, outside the story. The equilibrium is a volume of wine exported, a difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded in France at this particular world price.
Now let's consider some basic results from the economics of offshoring. You'll see the word offshoring, and you'll also see the word outsourcing. They're pretty similar. Wikipedia defines offshoring as, quote, the relocation by a company of a business process from one country to another. Sometimes it's called offshoring when that's within a single multinational firm, and outsourcing when you're trading with a foreign company, but don't expect to see these terms used very consistently. A famous example is call centers in India and the Philippines. If you need, say, help setting up your computer software, you make a phone call to a country outside the United States. Doing programming or also web design, those are areas where offshoring and outsourcing are common. The economics of offshoring involve several different elements, including foreign direct investment, comparative advantage, the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, the unbundling of the supply chain, and possibly factor price equalization. We have separate videos on all of these. I'm not going to cover them again, but just keep in mind each is very relevant to understanding offshoring. And if I had to say there's a single relevant point here, it's simply that offshoring represents another way of capturing international gains from trade. So what is it we know about offshoring? Well, we know global output goes up. We know that wages tend to go up in the poorer country. Returns to capital tend to go up in the wealthier country. In the wealthier country, consumer goods prices will fall because goods and services are cheaper, and also complementary jobs are created by offshoring. For instance, imagine you call up a foreign country to get help with your Apple product. That means you're more likely to buy Apple products, and that will create jobs in the United States selling Apple products to consumers. So what is it we don't know about offshoring? One question is whether wages will go up or down in the wealthier country, and of course this depends on which wages. It's an immediate intuition of many people that wages in the wealthier country must be going down, but that doesn't have to be true. First of all, offshoring gives you cheaper goods and services, and that tends to raise real wages. It's also the case that offshoring creates a lot of complementary jobs. If you can work, say, at a distance with people in India, you may have a better job and you may end up being paid more rather than less. To make it all more complicated, the conclusions you'll find in papers on offshoring may depend on when the paper was published. So if you read papers from the 1990s, they tend to be very positive about the wage effects of offshoring in the wealthier country. Papers through about 2006 or so, they're mostly positive on those wage effects, but they're beginning to be more skeptical. After 2006, we find many of the papers become more negative on the real wage effects in the wealthier countries. Now, you might think the later papers are in some sense always better, and maybe that's so, but keep in mind it could also be argued that these later data points are maybe in some sense outliers. But over time, on the question of real wage effects in the wealthier countries, there seems to have been an ongoing shift of opinion. What I find striking is the data is a marked shift in relative wages, and here's a graph of the relative wage of non-production to production workers. Think of the non-production workers, broadly speaking, as managers, and the production workers as people sitting in offices or cubicles or factories doing things. You can see here that starting right before the 1990s, the relative wage of managers relative to production workers is going up markedly. Now, increased offshoring is hardly the only reason for this change, but it does seem to be one reason. That picture, by the way, is taken from a very good survey piece by Robert Feenstra, cited here. In any case, we can tell a simple story about how greater offshoring will change the structure of relative wages, and that simple story will start with the onset of more and better information technology. Better information technology very much extends the reach of managers and makes it possible for them to manage more people from a distance and to manage people more effectively, even if a factory or plant is in some other country. Because of information technology, we can gather more data, we can analyze the data better, we're connected with the internet, and also we have cell phones. If there's a problem in one of your factories overseas, well, today it's possible to just give them a call. In any case, this greater reach means that the manager becomes more productive, and that's going to mean that the manager will earn more because there's this greater span of control. Yet at the same time, the relatively unskilled worker in the rich country faces more competition because now that worker is competing with unskilled workers in China, India, and other countries. So the same technological development, information technology, is causing here the income distribution to become more unequal. Managers will do quite well, owners of capital and owners of intellectual property will do quite well, and in general it may be the case that inequality goes up in both the rich and the poor country, which is in fact what we observe, yet at the same time global inequality is going down because people in poorer countries are now earning more relative to what people in the wealthier countries at the unskilled level had been earning. Looking at offshoring in this way also has directed the attention of researchers to what is sometimes called tasks or trade in tasks or the idea of quality ladders. You may recall that some of the older international trade theories, they're defined in terms of sectors. You make cars, you sell bananas, whatever. But the new way of thinking about the problem is trade is fundamentally in tasks. Any production process involves a lot of different tasks, and the wealthier countries will tend to specialize in the more difficult tasks, and that means high rewards to their skilled labor, and the poorer countries tend to specialize in the tasks which require less expertise. So, if we reconceptualize international trade as between high-skilled tasks and low-skilled tasks, rather than, say, different sectors where you're trading cars for bananas, this allows us to partially resurrect a Heckscher-Ohlin approach where we can think of the wealthier countries as having superior endowments for the high-skilled tasks and the poorer countries as having superior endowments for the low-skilled tasks. Some commentators have wondered whether offshoring is the new way in which we're taking some of our productivity gains. For instance, if you look at the years 2001 to 2004, You will find in those years that measured productivity is relatively high, yet wage gains in the United States were lacking. What's going on? Well, one hypothesis put forward by Michael Mandel is that the way we increased productivity was by offshoring. We did things overseas for cheaper. That is a kind of productivity gain for American firms, but it's not a productivity gain which is going to rebound to the benefit of American workers. In fact, it may lower their returns. Another question of relevance which remains underexplored is offshoring versus automation. So if no offshoring takes place, the alternative is not that things stay the way they were. It may be that if those workers are being paid high wages, automation will come along instead, and there still can be downward pressure on those wages. So in that sense, the net effect of offshoring on real wages may be weaker in the wealthier countries than sometimes it appears. Offshoring is a complex topic, and I've already referenced the other videos we've done which are of direct relevance. To read more directly on offshoring, I would recommend starting with these pieces listed here. They are all available online, and of course you can use Google to track down the relevant terms discussed in this video. Let's now consider some of the possible broader economic gains from multinational enterprises. The first order effect, of course, is if there's more capital invested in a country, that will tend to mean higher wages. So if Ford Motor opens up a plant, say in Mexico, that will raise the wages of the Mexican workers who end up with jobs there. But there also seem to be some second-order effects from what are called agglomeration spillovers. That is, having productive multinationals in your country makes it easier for you to create some kind of network where other firms and other workers are more productive as well. One notable gain is that multinationals, or MNEs, it seems they make the other domestic plants more efficient. There's a very good paper on that called Identifying Agglomeration Spillovers. Along related lines, it seems that having a multinational in your country, especially one which is exporting, it makes your other domestic exporters more efficient and more likely to be able to export themselves. And think about some of the mechanisms here. Having a multinational may help build up the infrastructure in a particular region. It may also help that economy access information about foreign markets, which will have spillover benefits for other potential exporters, and in general the relevant inputs for making something a potential export or even just for home consumption, those inputs become more available because of the activities of the multinational. On some of these factors, there's a very good piece by Aitken, Hansen, and Harrison. Multinationals also, on average, they pay higher wages, and this helps a country develop a thriving and more prosperous middle class, which may have spillover effects for social order, democracy, and other significant values. One good study of this wage effect is this piece on Mexico, Venezuela, and the United States. There's even some evidence that having a multinational will help spread skills to other workers. Maybe those workers once were employed at the multinational, but over time they quit and they take that knowledge to other firms. There's some evidence for this effect in a paper by Poole, which is a study of Brazil. Just to sum up, there really is a good deal of evidence that multinationals are likely to bring second-order long-run benefits to an economy. But it's not just the evidence. This is actually consistent with theory. In models with increasing returns and what are called agglomeration externalities, there tend to be benefits from creating a network of more productive firms with more knowledge and with higher paid workers, and multinationals help spread those benefits to a broader economy.
Today we're going to make a very basic but important point. We'll make it briefly. If international trade is good when your domestic industry is competitive, it's great when your domestic industry is a monopoly. Let's take a look with some diagrams. Okay, let's recap very quickly. Here is our usual situation, domestic supply curve. Here is the demand curve. Here is the no trade equilibrium with the price and the quantity. Let's now add that this country can buy as much as it wants at the world price. So domestic demand increases, domestic production decreases, we get a bunch of imports, and we know that that has two good welfare effects. We get increased gains from trade as people buy more, and we also get resource savings as production shifts from the high-cost domestic industry to the lower-cost world industry. That's a situation with international trade and a competitive domestic industry. Now let's look at what happens if the domestic industry is a monopoly. Okay, here's our basic competition with international trade diagram. Let's now reinterpret this assuming that the domestic industry is a monopoly, so we don't need the old price and quantity. And let's take this domestic supply curve and think about it instead as a marginal cost curve, so the monopolist has the same structure of cost as did the competitive industry. How do we find the monopolist's profit maximizing price and quantity? As you may recall from your microeconomics class, we create a marginal revenue curve. Profit maximizing price and quantity is found where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Let's put those on the diagram. So not surprisingly, the no trade equilibrium with monopoly is considerably worse than the no trade equilibrium with a competitive domestic industry. For all the usual reasons, the monopolist charges more and it produces less. Now, what happens when we have international free trade? Well, when we have free trade, amazingly, the free trade equilibrium is exactly the same. What this means is that international free trade can force the monopolist to behave exactly as if it were a competitive industry. The only difference is that shifting from monopoly to free trade internationally, we get an even bigger welfare effect. So we get much bigger gains from trade since the monopolist was producing a lot less than with the domestic industry. We get a much bigger increase in the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. And we also get some resource savings. Our resource savings here are smaller, but they're smaller precisely because the monopolist was producing less. So when we shift from the monopoly production to world production at lower costs, from the high-cost monopoly to the lower-cost world production, we get some resource savings, and are small simply because the monopolist wasn't producing that much. If we compare this diagram with the previous diagram, what we can see is that the welfare gains from shifting from monopoly to free trade are larger by this amount than if we shifted the competitive industry to free trade. I pointed out that the free trade equilibrium is exactly the same. Again, what this means is that international trade disciplines the monopolist. It forces the monopolist to produce as if it were a competitive industry. And in fact, the monopolist will produce at this point exactly the same, as I said, as if it were a competitive industry. So imports are going to be the same. We'll get the same amount of imports. Again, this is very important, particularly for small countries. So shifting from a competitive domestic industry to a lower-cost world industry creates gains from trade and resource savings. These gains are even bigger when what you are doing is shifting a monopoly to a free trade equilibrium. So particularly for small countries where they're going to be, because of natural monopoly, because of economies of scale, perhaps because of politics, small countries are bound to have a lot more monopolies than our larger countries, so international trade has even bigger benefits for small countries than it does for larger countries. Today we look at an important fact about international trade, the great prevalence and increasing importance of intra-industry trade. Here's a classic or paradigmatic example of what we typically think about when we think about trade based upon comparative advantage: wheat and cane sugar. So in this example, one country which has the comparative advantage in wheat, it exports wheat and it imports cane sugar. The other country produces and exports cane sugar and it imports wheat. Here's another paradigmatic or classic example, this one from Heckscher-Ohlin theory. Jet aircraft and shoes, or a high-skill, a high capital-intensive good, and a low-skill, low capital-intensive good. Again, the key here is that one country exports the jets and imports the shoes. The other country exports the low capital, low skill good, the shoes, and it imports the high skill, high capital good, the jets. Now, when we actually look at the trade data, however, what do we see? Well, the paradigmatic example in the data might actually be motorcycles. That is, one country exports these motorcycles and imports these motorcycles, and the other country imports these and exports these. Now, that's a little peculiar, because at first glance, these motorcycles look awfully similar. Why should one country be exporting one and importing the other, and vice versa for the other country? And yet, this intra-industry trade based upon similar goods, where one country is both exporting and importing the same good or a similar good, turns out to be very common. This intra-industry trade is what this lecture is all about. So intra-industry trade is the share of trade that is within or intra the industry, rather than across sectors. It's typically measured by the Grubel-Lloyd index. There are other indexes, but this one is the one which is most common. Let's show how this Grubel-Lloyd index works. Let's first here, the top is the absolute value of exports minus imports divided by the sum of exports and imports. So for example, suppose there's a good which a country exports but does not import. Well, then imports are going to be 0. This number is going to be 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. So in that case, intra-industry trade would be 0. That is, if we have a good which we export but don't import, intra-industry trade as measured by the Grubel-Lloyd index will be 0. Same thing if there's a good for which we import but we don't export it. On the other hand, suppose that exports equal imports. Okay, so we have a good for which the number of exports is about the same as the number of imports. Then this is 0 and this is 1. So the Grubel-Lloyd index for a good which we both export and import would be equal to 1. So let's give some examples. So in 2010, the U.S. exported $170 million worth of raw sugarcane, and it imported $1.9 billion of raw sugarcane. So this is a case where we import a lot of the good and export hardly any at all, so we should have a number which is close to 0. And in fact, when you do the calculation, you find that for cane sugar, the Grubel-Lloyd index is 0.164. In other words, there's not very much intra-industry trade. On the other hand, what about motorcycles? Well, in 2010, the U.S. exported about $1 billion worth of motorcycles, and we also imported about $1 billion, actually $1.2 billion worth of motorcycles. So if you calculate the Grubel-Lloyd index, what you find is it should be close to 1, and in fact it is. It's 0.909. So that's how you calculate intra-industry trade. Let's look at what it is across some different countries. To measure the amount of intra-industry trade by country, we're going to take those indexes which we just calculated by product or by industry in the last slide, and we're going to sum them all up, weighting each by the share of total trade. And if you do that, you can get an intra-industry trade statistic for the country as a whole. And a bunch of these are shown over here. These are measured in really just the same way. Instead of 0.9, it's multiplied by 100 to get us 90. But what this indicates is that countries near the top, most of their trade is intra-industry trade. So Belgium, France, United Kingdom, Spain, they are importing and exporting very many similar goods. Even the United States has a inter-industry trade statistic of 72. So that means the paradigmatic example for the United States is not the cane sugar example, which had a inter-industry statistic of about 0.1, but instead is the motorcycle example, closer to the motorcycle. So the United States is often importing and exporting similar goods. Down here towards the bottom, we get countries which have lower levels of intra-industry trade. Australia and Chile, for example, these countries export a lot of minerals, which they don't so much import, so their values are lower. For most developed countries in the world, however, the inter-industry trade statistic is very high indeed. Intra-industry trade also varies by the industry that we're talking about. So for medical and pharmaceutical products, the United States both exports a lot of these products, but it imports a lot of them as well. So intra-industry trade is very high. On the other hand, for footwear, the United States mostly imports footwear. It doesn't export footwear. And for other countries as well, the other countries may export a lot of footwear and not import a lot of footwear. So around the world, in fact, footwear tends to have low intra-industry trade. You're either exporting it or you're importing it, not both. Same thing with medical and pharmaceutical products. You're probably doing both, exporting and importing those products. There's some hint here, by the way, that the industries with high intra-industry trade show a little bit more monopoly power, a little bit more suitable perhaps for monopolistic competition. That's the theory that we're working towards, and there's some evidence for that, though just a little bit, in this kind of description here. What this graph shows is that intra-industry trade has become more important as a total share of world trade. So if we go back to that paradigmatic example of comparative advantage, of trading wheat for cane sugar, in Ricardo's time, that example was indeed representative. That wheat for cane sugar idea, intra-industry trade was quite low. So that example at that time was representative. But we're moving from a world in which trading wheat for cane sugar is representative towards one in which trading motorcycle for motorcycle is representative. Okay, these are important facts to know, but what does it all mean? I've already hinted at sort of a traditional story, which is not quite correct, but let's give the traditional story. It's that comparative advantage and Aksher-Ohlin theory explains trade across different goods or countries, and thus has difficulty explaining intra-industry trade. So the fact of intra-industry trade was used to motivate many of the new trade models based upon increasing returns, based upon a product differentiation and monopolistic competition. So Helpman and Krugman, who were key pioneers in this area, said that trade patterns seem to include substantial two-way trade in goods of similar factor intensity. This inter-industry trade seems both pointless and hard to explain from the point of view of conventional trade analysis. So they argued that in order to explain inter-industry trade, you needed a new theory, and the theory which they and others, Krugman in particular was a pioneer, Helpman too, was one based upon product differentiation, internal economies of scale, and monopolistic competition. And that's the theory which we're moving towards, but we have to provide one footnote to that before we get there. Once it became clear that the inter-industry fact was important, theorists began to ask, is it really the case that the only theory capable of explaining inter-industry trade is the increasing returns monopolistic competition theory? And they raised two objections. The first objection, perhaps a more minor objection, but an interesting conceptual one, is what is the right level to define an industry? So we took the industry definition as motorcycles, but that's arbitrary. That was just chosen by a government statistician for entirely different purposes. Why choose that level of definition? If we aggregate even further, we can make almost all trade intra-industry. So, for example, if we said that the industry is not motorcycles but vehicles, then much more of trade is going to be intra-industry. On the other hand, if we said, no, the right level of aggregation is not motorcycles but big engine motorcycles and small engine motorcycles, then almost no trade would be intra-industry. If we define the industry to be coincident with the product itself, then no trade would be intra-industry. So it's somewhat arbitrary at what level of aggregation that we choose. Second objection, and a more important one, is that small changes to comparative advantage and Heckscher-Ohlin theory can in fact explain inter-industry trade. And the basic idea is this. In trade theory, an industry means activities with similar factor shares. But if producing, let's say, Harley motorcycles and Kawasaki motorcycles use similar factor shares, and if there's factor price equalization, then precisely because these industries are similar, these products are similar, small differences in productivity can generate lots of specialization. Small differences in productivity in a factor price equalization world can generate lots of specialization. So what do we make of this? Well, my view is that microeconomic evidence suggests that product differentiation, internal increasing returns, and monopolistic competition are important. So even if we look outside the trade theory, there is evidence for these assumptions of the theory. Moreover, this new trade theory does in fact offer a compelling explanation of inter-industry trade and other trade facts. It's also not entirely clear to me whether other theories can explain all of the facts, including, for example, the inter-industry trade statistics by industry. Which industries have the most inter-industry trade? Monopolistic competition theory offers an answer to that based upon monopoly power. It's not clear that Heckscher-Ohlin theory does. But maybe the theorist will come up with something. I don't know. In any case, we're going to be looking closely at new trade theory, even if it cannot be judged to be the only theory capable of explaining the facts. It's certainly an important theory, and we're going to spend some time on it. Here's some further reading. Marius Brulhart has a good account of the statistics across nations. Helpman and Krugman, who were key players in the new trade theory, they summed up a lot of their work from the early 1980s in their book, Market Structure and Foreign Trade. A more recent textbook, Krugman, Obstfeld, and Militz, has some good material on this subject. And the key paper in the counterattack, showing that Heckscher-Ohlin and comparative advantage could explain inter-industry trade, is this important paper by Donald Davis. Thanks.
Now let's consider the topic of intra-firm trade, which is what happens when resources are transferred within the confines of a single firm, but across national borders. Intra-firm trade doesn't receive so much attention, but actually, according to one estimate, about 1/3 of all of world trade is within firms. There are also some notable patterns for intra-firm trade. Most importantly, it seems to be concentrated in capital-intensive industries. It's also the case that intra-firm trade flows mostly between capital-intensive countries, which are on average, of course, also the wealthier countries. When it comes to the United States, the country is especially likely to import capital-intensive goods through firms, and an example there would be chemicals. When it comes to labor-intensive goods, such as, for instance, textile products, it's more likely that those goods are bought across borders from separate firms. Paul Entras, who has written one of the best-known studies of this phenomenon, put the question in the following way, quote, "Why are capital-intensive goods transacted within the boundaries of multinational firms, while labor-intensive goods are traded at arm's length?" Another way to put the puzzle is to note that at least when it comes to international trade, there is a higher propensity to integrate firms in capital-intensive industries. Some relevant hypotheses here cite transactions costs theories of the firm, as developed, for instance, by Ronald Coase and Oliver Williamson. For instance, imagine that it's the case that hiring really must be done locally, that there's something about choosing the right labor inputs that cannot be done in some other country far away, but must be done on the spot. Autonomy is important for labor hiring decisions. So then when you have businesses and lines of business which require a lot of labor hiring, that is labor-intensive production, you will tend to have separate firms. In contrast, imagine perhaps that a large capital investment must actually be planned centrally by one central business group, that perhaps the capital investment occurs across national borders and it's based on cost sharing, but you can't have plants in separate countries doing their own capital planning. You then would end up with a situation where firms with capital-intensive productions would tend to be multinationals. If we put all the pieces together, these hypotheses do in fact appear to explain the data. The capital-intensive lines of production are run by larger multinationals, and the trade across borders is largely intra-firm, and this is for reasons of transactions costs. The lines of production which require a lot of labor, the labor-intensive lines, those require greater local autonomy and greater decentralization, and then when it comes to the final outputs, you tend to have more explicit trade rather than allocation within a multinational. We can't be sure that's the right answer, but it is one interesting way to think about this puzzle, and it does seem to fit the observed data. The basic arguments here, including the numbers, are taken from a well-known piece by Paul Antras available online called Firms, Contracts, and Trade.
Today is the first of a series of lectures on trade and economies of scale. In this one, we're going to look at trade and external economies of scale. We've already looked at a number of theories which implicitly make predictions about which countries should trade the most. So comparative advantage says the trade ought to occur most between countries which have different levels of productivity. The Heckscher-Ohlin theory says that trade ought to occur the most between countries with different factor shares. So both of these theories imply that countries should trade the most with countries from which they are the most different. However, a large fraction of trade actually occurs between countries which are quite similar in productivity and in factor shares. For example, there's a huge amount of trade between US and Canada. And more generally, there's a lot of trade between the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and Japan, the developed economies. Now, this doesn't mean that comparative advantage and Heckscher-Ohlin theory are wrong, but it does certainly mean that they're incomplete. And we want to look at some other theories which may help us to explain some of the facts about trade. In particular, we're going to be focusing on economies of scale, which come in two types. First, external economies of scale. These are at the industry level, and I'll explain this more as I go along. And then second, internal economies of scale at the firm level. It turns out that the second is more difficult to analyze analytically because it requires us to understand monopolistic competition. We can't have straightforward competition with internal economies of scale at the firm level. So we'll talk more about that in a future lecture. Today we're going to focus on external economies of scale. Let's take a look. An important fact about many industries is they're not spread randomly around a country or around the world. Take carpet, for example. For over 100 years, the city of Dalton has been known as the carpet capital of the world. Over 100 firms produce carpet in Dalton, Georgia, and they combined produce over 70% of the world's entire production of tufted carpet. Now, not all industries cluster. So which ones cluster and why did they cluster? Why did Dalton, Georgia become the carpet capital of the world? Industrial clusters are very common. There's a small town in China with a population of just 36,000 that makes over 3 billion toothbrushes a year. Hangzhou, China produces 80% of China's toothbrush production. There are over 990 manufacturers in the Hangzhou cluster, and toothbrushes have been made there since 1827. That's another interesting fact about these clusters. Once they start, they tend to remain in place for a long time. They're very stable. Here's another cluster with which you're very familiar, Hollywood. Why is it that so many movies, not just in the United States, but for the world, are made in Hollywood? And if they're not made in Hollywood, they're probably made in another industrial cluster, Bollywood, in India. In order to understand why some industries cluster, it's useful to think about how a cluster evolves. And these principles have repeated themselves over and over again in many different types of industries. So typically, first one firm enters, and it might enter at a particular location due, let's say, to some geographic factors which lower its costs modestly in that location. So for example, California is good for filming all year round, so it made some sense for an early movie studio to begin in California. It doesn't have to have, the first entrant doesn't have to have cost advantages, however. Dalton, Georgia got its start when a young girl handcrafted a bedspread, which proved particularly popular. She got her friends making similar bedspreads, and this gave rise to an entire industry. Now think about a second firm. It looks around and asks where should it locate. And it notices that by locating near the first firm, it can take advantage of some specialized labor, of suppliers, of shippers, of some ready-made infrastructure. So the second firm enters at the same location. The third firm finds cost advantages of locating near the first two even greater. And so a cluster begins to develop until pretty soon this one spot happens to be the lowest cost place to producing that particular type of good. Let's think about Hollywood, for example. In order to make a movie, you need very quickly to assemble a large team of specialized, talented labor. If you're making a movie in Dubuque, Iowa, and your cameraman gets sick and heaven forbids dies, it's going to be really hard to find another cameraman. If you're making the same movie in the LA area, you can have another cameraman there in hours. And suppliers. If you need in your movie, suddenly you need a rewrite and you need to have an alien costume and a Roman temple, you can have all of those goods delivered to you. There are prop shops built, large prop shops, which service the entire industry. So at low cost, you can find things that you want very quickly. The same thing is true for carpets, which are created through specialized machinery, which requires informed, educated labor. So it's no surprise that the community colleges in Dalton, Georgia, also specialize in teaching people the skills used to make carpets. Even producing toothbrushes can require a lot of specialized machinery, and it helps for a firm to be located in the Hangzhou area because it can easily find the labor and the expertise that it needs in order to build toothbrushes. So this is how an industry evolves to become a cluster, and when it is clustered, it becomes the lowest cost place to produce these particular types of goods. Clusters can also help to create new innovations and inventions and improvements which lower the cost curve even further at any different quantity. So the great economist Alfred Marshall said, "Great are the advantages which people following the same skilled trade get from near neighborhood. The mysteries of the trade become no mysteries, but are as it were in the air, and children learn many of them unconsciously." This is definitely the case in Dalton, Georgia, and in Hangzhou, China. Good work is rightly appreciated. Inventions and improvements in machinery, in processes, and the general organization of the business have their merits promptly discussed. If one man starts a new idea, it is taken up by others and combined with suggestions of their own, and thus it becomes the source of further new ideas. So again, once a cluster becomes established, the costs fall quickly in that cluster, first in that cluster. They fall there before they fall anywhere else. And again, this is a reason why a firm wants to be located in a cluster with other similar firms. External economies of scale imply that as the industry gets larger, the costs of each firm in that industry begin to fall. And this means that the supply curve for the industry can actually be downward sloping, at least over a part of its range. So the supply or industry average cost curve, in contrast to the usual supply curve, which is upward sloping, can actually slope downwards, particularly as the cluster is being established. So when Dalton, Georgia is small, the carpet industry has high costs. But as the industry in Dalton grows larger, the costs to each firm in that industry begin to fall. Notice that what this means is that when an industry is large, it's going to be very difficult to start an industry anywhere else because the costs to production are lowest in Dalton, Georgia, where it already has economies of scale, where the economies of scale have already been built up. Let's now see what implications there are for trade when we have external economies of scale. So let's suppose that there are two industries, toothbrushes and carpets, two countries, the United States and China, or Canada if you like, it doesn't matter which. And let's suppose that we have no trade. So in the initial equilibrium, let's suppose that the U.S. demand is in blue and the Chinese demand, we'll say, is in green. Same thing over here, U.S. demand for carpets is in blue, Chinese demand for carpets is in green. So the demand is the size of the market in these two countries. Given the size of the market, given the demand in the United States, the price of toothbrushes in the United States will be here, and the quantity of toothbrushes sold will be here. Same thing for carpets. The price of U.S. carpets is given here and the quantity here. China has got a, let's say, slightly bigger market than the U.S. market, so because of economies of scale, it has a lower price of toothbrushes and a bigger quantity, and same here, a lower price of carpets and a bigger quantity. We could mix and match these however we want. It doesn't really matter. Now, here's the point. Suppose that we now introduce trade. Well, what will happen? Well, one thing which could happen is that these industries cluster in just such a way that we get more of both goods. So, for example, let's look at the total world demand for toothbrushes, which is simply just the U.S. demand plus the Chinese demand. So this is the total world demand for toothbrushes. This is the total world demand for carpet. Again, just the U.S. demand plus the Chinese demand. Now, if now we have a cluster such that all the toothbrushes are made in China and all the carpets are made in the United States, then the cost of producing toothbrushes falls, the cost of producing carpets falls, so now China produces a lot more toothbrushes, their quantity of production increases. The United States produces a lot more carpet, but because the cost of both of these goods has fallen due to taking advantage of these external economies of scale, China and the United States can trade carpet for toothbrushes, and both countries can be better off. So by taking advantage of larger markets allow you to extract everything possible from these external economies of scale. By building the toothbrush industry bigger in one location and building the carpet industry in Dalton, Georgia, by making that larger, we can take advantage of all the possible external economies of scale, push our costs down to the minimum level, and then trade. And since costs for both products have gone down, both countries will be better off. Let's look at two interesting effects in the presence of external economies of scale. First, I'm going to call this the big get bigger effect. Let's take a look. Suppose there are two countries. We're going to call them big and small. The big country is not necessarily big in size, but it has a big market for this particular product. So here's the demand curve for big. Here's the one for small. Also, we're going to suppose that the average cost curve or the supply curve in the big market does not fall as far as in the small market. In other words, at any particular quantity, the costs of producing that quantity of good are lower in the small market than they are in the big market. However, the big market starts off big. So the big market starts off with a cost advantage due to the fact that it can take advantage of these economies of scale. So now notice what happens if we now introduce free trade. Well, if we have free trade, and here's our world demand curve, we may end up at what I call the historical equilibrium. That is, something plausible which happens is that the big market gets bigger. Because it begins with the cost advantage, it's able to outcompete the suppliers in the small market so that we end up with the big market taking the dominant share, taking the world market. That historical equilibrium is opposed to the ideal equilibrium. If everything was ideal, the location of the cluster would be in the small market because that's where you reduce costs the most. But because the small market starts off small, it ends up even smaller. The big get bigger, the small get smaller. So in theory, what this means is that we don't always end up at the ideal equilibrium. This is a little bit sad, probably not too much to worry about, because what we really want to do is make sure that we take advantage of the trade to take advantage of these economies of scale. But it does mean that we don't necessarily get to the ideal equilibrium. The chains of history bind us so that we may end up at the historical equilibrium. The second effect, there can only be one effect, is closely related. There can only be one Dalton, Georgia. There can only be one Seattle, Washington, or Silicon Valley, or Hollywood. I mean, literally, this is not true, but there certainly aren't going to be many. Some people argue that in order to be the one, we should have strategic trade policy. That is, there are some benefits to being Dalton, Georgia, or to being Seattle, Washington, or Silicon Valley. And if we could, we would like to be the ones who eat up those benefits. So what these people suggest is that we ought to, for example, protect our industries. We ought to throw up tariffs and barriers to trade so that our small industries become big. We allow them to grow until they get the cost advantages of economies of scale, and only then do we open them up to world trade. And because we only open up to world trade once our industries have got these economies of scale, we're then able to dominate the world and take over these industries. We may end up at the historical equilibrium, or if we're lucky, we may end up at the ideal equilibrium if we happen to start off small and then we grew our industry. But either way, the point of strategic trade policy is that we end up being the one. Now, again, this idea works in theory. In practice, it can be a little bit dangerous. If every country tries to be the one, then every country may end up trying to protect its industries, trying to grow its industries behind these tariff walls, and we may never get the advantages of the economies of scale which free trade can produce. So for the world as a whole, it's probably more important that industries cluster around the world and we take advantage of clustering and then trade than it is that we are the ones who end up with the cluster. It would be nice if we did, but we probably can't tip the balance that often. It's going to be very tricky to be able to tip the balance in our favor, and the times in which we are able to tip the balance probably do not justify the number of times where, because of the tariffs and the quotas, we don't get all of the economies of scale that we can get. Anyway, that's my opinion from evaluating this literature. Other people may differ, but strategic policy is something which can work in theory. One more point before we conclude. External economies of scale and dynamic economies of scale can also occur across industries. That is, the ideas in one industry can cross-pollinate or fertilize ideas in another industry, can lower costs in another industry. Having a lot of smart people together in an area where they can communicate with one another, you never know what idea is going to be particularly fruitful, be particularly profitable in a place where the first person might never have thought to apply that idea, but the second person can apply that idea. These are also called agglomeration economies or synergies. And this most fundamentally explains why we have cities. After all, there are a lot of disadvantages to cities. There are congestion, it's more expensive to live in a city, costs are higher in a city, and yet people are more productive in cities. It's not just that more productive people go to live in cities, although that happens too. It's that the same people are more productive in a city. They generate more ideas when they're around other people who generate ideas. So this explains why the external economies of scale and international trade also have implications for economic geography, and it's why Paul Krugman, for example, made pioneering contributions to both fields. Anyway, perhaps we'll say more about that another day, but it's a little bit far afield, so we'll turn now to further references. So Paul Krugman's 1996 paper does a good job explaining increasing returns and how they apply to trade and also to clusters. Clusters are also discussed in Michael Porter's book from a business point of view. This is a more empirical point of view, the competitive advantage of nations. The World Bank, their 2009 report, has got a lot of information on clusters from all over the world. And Paul Krugman's 1991 book, Geography and Trade, explains the link in greater detail between international trade, the ideas of international trade, and the ideas of economic geography. Thanks.
Now let's talk about the benefits from specialization and trade. Suppose we have two countries, one called Shirtland, another called Chipland. And Shirtland and Chipland can each produce shirts and chips. Now we can look at how much each country can produce. Here let's look at Shirtland. Suppose Shirtland can produce 108 shirts per day, or 36 chips per day. Now what does that mean? Well, it means there's an internal trade-off for each chip is the equivalent of 3 shirts, right? Because 108 divided by 36 is 3. So each chip is worth 3 shirts, and thus the opportunity cost of chips is 3 shirts per chip. If we look the other way, what's the opportunity cost for shirts? It's 1/3 of a chip per shirt. So Shirtland is going to have a production possibilities curve, which we're going to look at here in a second, that represents this trade-off. Chipland can produce 120 shirts per day or 120 chips per day. So given this trade-off, we can see that the opportunity cost of shirts is 1 chip, and the opportunity cost of chips is 1 shirt, because it's a 1-to-1 trade-off given their production. Let's see what this looks like. If we draw production possibilities curves for each country, we can see Chipland can produce 120 shirts or 120 chips or anywhere in between. Now that means that they can consume anywhere on their production possibilities curve or anywhere inside their production possibilities curve, just based on their own production technology and abilities. If we look at Shirtland, we can see that Shirtland can produce less. They can produce 108 shirts or 36 chips or anywhere in between. Now, let's see what would happen if they decided to trade. Now, given the opportunity costs that we looked at in our last slide, we know that Shirtland has the comparative advantage in the production of shirts, and Chipland has a comparative advantage in the production of chips. So we're going to look at an example where Chipland produces only chips, and Shirtland produces only shirts. In other words, they're going to specialize in the good for which they have the comparative advantage. Well, let's see what that happens if they then trade with each other. Suppose there was an ability to trade shirts and chips, and the price was such that each shirt was equal to 1/2 of a chip, or each chip is going to be worth 2 shirts. This is going to be what we call the terms of trade, or the price that they can trade those. So suppose we look at Chipland first. Now Chipland specializes in chips and produces 120 chips per day. Suppose they decided they didn't want any of those chips, they wanted to trade them all for shirts. Then they could get 240 shirts. And if we connected their production with how much they can consume, we can see we can get something called their production possibilities. So if a country specializes in what they have a comparative advantage in, and then trades it on the world market at a better price than they can internally trade it, given their production technology, the consumption possibilities curve is outside of the production possibilities curve. The same is going to be true for Shirtland. Shirtland specializes in the production of shirts and can trade them at each shirt for a half a chip instead of each shirt for a third of a chip, which was their own opportunity cost. So their consumption possibilities curve is also outside of their production possibilities curve. So each country, when they specialize in what they have a comparative advantage in and then trade on the world market, can consume outside of their production possibilities curve. This is the gains from trade when we specialize in what you have a comparative advantage in. So how does free trade affect employment? Well, if you're a country that's producing both shirts and chips and then you decide to specialize in chips, those that were producing and working in the shirt industry are going to lose their job. Ideally, they'll move over into the chip industry, but this may or may not be the case for everybody. So there are going to be some costs. Under free trade, each nation will begin to specialize in a single good, causing considerable changes in the country's employment in different industries. Switching from self-sufficiency to specialization, increase in consumption in both nations. So on average, people in each nation benefit, but some people in both nations will be harmed by free trade if they're not able to move into the new industry.